What's fantastic is we've had a lot of questions that have come in where people would love to get some help from you, Steve. So we'd love to now jump across to the most frequently asked questions that have come in from our runners. So we'll start again with training. And the first question we've got here is, how do I choose a race target? I'm doing the 10K. I'm 16 years old. I've had 8 weeks training and now getting the paces down to 4 minutes 30, which is really good. How would you advise people to try and work out how do they select a race pace or race goal from what they're seeing in training?
And can I say thanks for the audience for putting the questions to me. And I really enjoy the discussion and obviously covers areas I sometimes might take for granted. Now, for me, that's a great example. At 16, a 10K race, that's a solid distance to be doing. And of 8 weeks training, hopefully you've done some running before that, but of 8 weeks training, if you're running at 4:30K pace, again, I say racing replicates training. So if you're running 4:30 now, I think realistically for you, run at 4:30 pace for that 10K. So get the 10K done at 4:30, then have another training block, and then maybe set another 10K in a couple of months where you can maybe get your pace down to 4:20. So gradual improvements. But if that's what you're training at, then realistically, that is what you would expect to race at.
Fantastic. And we've touched on this already, but we've got a question here on race simulation. So would running a race simulation for a marathon runner, say 30K, be a good measure for race readiness? And how many weeks would be a good balance between going too early and too late? I think it would be really interesting to discuss this across the distances, because I think there's a really big question here as well around how far should that race simulation be? And obviously we really don't want to be in that danger zone and blow ourselves up before a race. But if you could run through the distances and what a good race simulation would be in timing, that would be incredibly helpful.
So race simulation for me, I'm sort of old school. So because I was doing so much distance and volume in my training, I actually could just do an 8K hit out a couple of weeks before. That was enough for me because I was so strong that for me just to sharpen up and get my legs going at quicker than race pace was fine. So it sounds strange, but I was running 42K and an 8K a couple of weeks out was fine for me. But if you're not doing that amount of volume, then you need to have a race hit out that's closer to race distance. So again, I'm sort of thinking, 75%, 80%. So if you're running the 5K, I would think just a 3K hit out would be fine because it's 5K is not a long distance. And then 10K, you might just have a 5K, do a park run. So you have to make it practical. I could say do a 7.5K hit out, which is 75% of 10K. But if you can't find one, just go to park run. It's easy. It's every Saturday, So make it practical to you. So shorter than race distance, but preferably greater than half race distance. So again, for the half marathon, you're probably looking at a 10K and maybe you do a warm up or a little bit at the back end just to get you through a bit further. But for the marathon, it's quite specific. It's going to be very difficult for you to find a race over a half marathon. So you might want to do a time trial or what we call a tempo run of more, 30K plus, because you're going to be doing 42K at a certain pace. Well, you need to have at least given your body exposure to preferably 32K at that race pace. But you need to do it far enough out, so 2 or 3 weeks out, to give your body time to recover. So it's as much about the mental preparation, knowing that you're going to be on the start line thinking, hey, I've got this covered. A couple of weeks ago, I did a 35K hit out at race pace. So, I've just got to do an extra 6 or 7K and there's a crowd around me. It's going to be fantastic. I've got lots of help and we've got gels and drink stations along the way, so lock it in, I'll be fine. So that's the kind of mindset that you want to have about over half race distance, and just to give you the mental confidence to know that you're going to be able to cope on the day.
Brilliant. And you've also mentioned hitting the wall, and this is somewhere we really want to help out the audience. So also it's got some other terminology, but how do we avoid here bonking or hitting the wall? And there's obviously a couple of factors which may lead into that, but your advice here would be fantastic.
I don't want to keep harping on it, but if you train properly, you're highly unlikely to bonk or hit the wall. Now, if you've trained appropriately and then you got your watch, you got your time set, and you stick to that race pace that you've set that's practical, realistic, and possible, you should be fine. If you go out too hard, you're going to blow up and you will hit the wall. So what we spoke about earlier, if you get sucked in and you suddenly change your pace and you're running much quicker than what you've done in training and what you can expect to do, then you will hit the wall. Training, firstly, is really important. And then it's being realistic about what pace you want to run, and then it's sticking to it. The things you can obviously do is to have a gel or make sure you're keeping hydrated. So on the drink stations, making sure you're grabbing your water or your sports drink just to top up your electrolytes. And that will help just stave off hitting the wall or bonking. So they're things you can do during the race. But hopefully, if your training's been good and you pace yourself properly, they're just bonuses and you're not really relying on them. They're a help, but they're not really your bread and butter. You've locked it in because you've trained really well leading in.
Great stuff. Another question we get often is around monitoring. Is monitoring your heart rate important? If so, what should I be looking for in my training?
Well, it's important to me because, I'm still doing sessions. There's probably two parts to that. I think you need to be aware of what your heart rate zones are. So, I'm 59 now. So, my max is dropping down a little. It's still pretty high. I still get it up in the 180. So I'm still going pretty well. But you need to be able to monitor it in session. You just want to use it as a guide in session. So you don't want to be going, oh, wow, I'm way too high. I've got to pull back. You can ease in and out. So you use it as a bit of a sort of a fallback, as a bit of a guide. But then when it's really important is when you then download your info afterwards, I look at it and I say, oh, wow, gee, no wonder I was starting to drop away in those last couple of reps or the back end of that tempo run because my heart rate was too high and I was pushing from a long way out. And I would expect in a session early on, my heart rate gets up, but I recover really well. So it drops down and then it sort of flatlines a little bit. But then hopefully you get through the session and you just peak a little bit right at the end. But if it's really shooting up or your times are dropping away, then you need to just reflect on, okay, I didn't pace myself very well. Maybe do less reps next week and try and hold that pace, or either do the same number of reps at a slower pace. So it's a good post-race indicator of how strong you were in your session. You've got to learn from that. So it's a learning session. You put it back in and the next time, you might have a peek at it while you're doing the session. So it's a bit of both. In session, just as an advisory tool, and then out of session, really good feedback and learnings.
Fantastic. The next question we have here is for somebody running the half marathon, two-part question. So should my long runs be between 10 to 13K or 15 to 18? And should I be doing these long runs?
Great question. Love that one. I think definitely 15 to 18. In fact, 18. It's 15 to 18, but 18 would be great. And it should be once a week. And it is bread and butter. So I talk to people, the first thing I talk to them about is if you only do one thing a week, it's the long run. And ultimately, that's what you are doing, because ultimately you are racing at a particular distance and your training in one run is to get as close to that distance as we possibly can, with a few sessions and a few other runs around it in the week, and your weekly mileage enough to make sure that you can build up strength to get through the distance. So that's pretty much my training philosophy. So every week, and that sort of 3/4, even if you could get to race distance, even better. I was running 35K on a Sunday morning, and you think, well, that's about 75% of race distance, my 42K. But I ran another 10K that night. I'm not encouraging you to do that, but that was how important it was for me to be doing more than race distance. I did it in 2 runs, but I did cover it in the day.
That's a massive help. Thank you, Steve. And we're now getting to a really interesting topic, and it can be a really unsettling time. We've had a huge investment in training as runners. We're getting down to those last few weeks where we could often do something to derail the performance or to impact race day. And this is a question around tapering. And what we've had come in here is, look, my training program has a 3-week taper. I feel this is excessive and I feel really underdone on race week. Would I be better with, say, a 2-week taper? And obviously it's individual, but we'd love your advice.
Again, this is a ripper question. And think about this. So you've trained for 4 weeks and you're going to taper for 3. Probably not going to work. Okay, you haven't trained. That'd only be 1 week of training and 3-week taper. So it really depends on how much training you've got. So I did a 3 or 4 week taper because I'd trained for 12 months, 10 years, really. I was preparing for these races cumulative over years and years. So for me, a 3 or 4 week taper was all relative to the amount of running that I'd done. So if you've done 16 weeks, say 15 weeks, that's a nice number. I like to think if you've done a 15-week training block, about a fifth of that is 3 weeks. So a 3-week taper is fine. If you've done an 8-week training block, I'm probably thinking you might only need a 2-week taper. And if you've done a 4-week training block, you don't need to taper at all. Just keep going because you obviously haven't done enough running to deserve a taper. So you're actually training into the event. You'll probably get fit during the race. So it's relative to the amount of training that you've done. And it might be excessive 3 weeks if you've only done 8 or 9. But if you've done a really good solid training block, you will need 3 weeks. And remember, you can actually taper for 3 weeks. And if you're feeling a little bit fresh, you can actually do a bit of running that last week. If you're feeling so fresh that you want to do a bit, you can train up a little bit more again, but just do that off a plan or with your coach or with someone as a sounding board because you don't want to be tired leading into the race.